Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, and welcome to the Dworkin and Bernstein Management Lecture Series at Lakeland Community College. We have a special presentation tonight with a panel discussion on doing business in China. The Dworkin and Bernstein Management Lecture Series is brought to you by the generous endowment of the Dworkin and Bernstein Company, LPA, and is being held tonight in collaboration with the Lakeland International Education Center. Eric Usach, who is in the eyes, there he is with his hand up, is the chair of the Lakeland International Education Center. And the idea for this program tonight was actually the brainchild of Jennifer Nampountis, who was the past chair of the International Education Center. Tonight we're going to discuss the aspects of doing business in China, and our panelists have experience in all aspects of the methods of entering the global marketplace. As shown on our slide here, I'm sure you have seen this slide in Intro to Business and Marketing and Management and virtually every class you've taken. For those of you who do not have a business degree, everybody sees this because these are the steps that bring us to international trade. And so just briefly, I want to cover these. And starting at the first level of international trade, we see exporting, which is a function of international trade where goods are produced in one country and are shipped to another country for future sale or trade. Next, we move into the next three together. Those are licensing, franchising, and contract manufacturing, where a business sets up where one company gives another company permission to manufacture its products for a specific payment. The next level of this is the joint venture. And this is where a company buys part of a foreign company or joins with a foreign company to create a new company and produce products there. And finally, the highest level is direct investment, where a company builds or buys facilities in a foreign country and operates that business as a division of the business in their home country. As you can see from the chart, the methods farther to the right on the chart that the business chooses to use to enter into the global market, the farther they are to the right, the higher is the risk, but at the same time, the higher is the return. Each of our panelists has experience in these methods, and we'd like to begin our lecture tonight with a discussion of the opportunities in China to expand using these methods. And so I'm going to start off with Kimberly Helizna. Kimberly Helizna is the International Trade Administrator for the City of Menor, where she implements international trade initiative for current and prospective companies looking to expand or develop markets and attract foreign businesses with a particular emphasis on manufacturing. She previously served as the consultant with HK International in Atlanta, where she advised international companies on how to develop global strategies within particular markets. She also worked as a trade manager for the Ohio Export Assistance Network and the Dayglow Corporation. She is a board member of the International Business Network. She has a master's degree in international business from Baldwin Wallace and is a certified global business advisor as well as a certified global business professional. So Kim, can you start us off by telling us the opportunities for American businesses to export to China? And has that changed over time, and do you expect the opportunities to get better or worse in the next 5 years?
Well, there's still a huge market in China. China is the largest market in the world, and U.S. companies have to be smart about what they export. So products that have some advantage or that are somewhat of a niche tend to do better. Chinese customers are much more savvy now than, say, maybe they were 5 or 10 years ago. And with the increased availability of the internet and information on the internet, it's easy for them to get information. And globalization of the world economy also means that U.S. companies now have to compete with their European, other Asian, and American counterparts. So these days, U.S. companies must have an advantage in order to be competitive in the Chinese market. And I see that continuing. And I always recommend to the small business that you do your homework and we research and determine, is that the best place for me to be right now or not?
Would you recommend that a company that has not done any international business go straight to China, or would you recommend that they start somewhere else first?
usually not the first place for a small business because it's complex, the market is, and there's a lot of rules and regulations. So I always suggest starting out simple. You know, Canada is still considered an export market along with Mexico, and because of the trade agreement we have there, it's a lot easier for U.S. companies to get started. They learn about, you know, what it takes, the shipping process and procedures, they learn the compliance aspect, and then depending on their product, it may make sense for them to try China or it may not. It just depends on, you know, the product that they have. You know, there's certain, and I'm sure we'll get to this, there's certain industries that will do better. You know, I was talking just a few minutes ago that food products are very good to export to China. If you are in that business, China's actually a net importer rather than, so that means they import more food products than they export.
Very good, thank you. I'd like to jump now to the highest point on the chart, the farthest to the right, which is direct investment in China. Ka-Pi Ho is currently doing just that for Lubrizol. Dr. Ka-Pi Ho is the head of research, development, and testing for Lubrizol Additives China. She joined Lubrizol in 1988 as a research chemist. She has held a variety of positions involving research technology, commercial development, and resource management, including an expatriate assignment in the United Kingdom. In her current role as an expatriate in China, Dr. Ho leads the expansion of the company's Zhuhai laboratory facilities in support of business initiatives in China. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in polymer engineering from Case Western Reserve University, and she has also earned her master's and doctorate degrees in molecular science from CWRU. Ka-Pi, can you explain what it is you're doing for Lubrizol in China, and what opportunity is there for companies who want to leap to operating in China?
Yeah, so Lubrizol is actually investing in building a facility, a manufacturing plant, as well as a laboratory. And so I've been in China for 2.5 years now, overseeing construction, and then also now overseeing building the people, the culture, and the processes to actually run the lab. And I've actually left my husband at home, so that's been another challenge in trying to do the assignment. I think one of the things that there is opportunities. I think 5 to 10 years ago, it was very difficult to try and build your own facility. And Lubrizol actually started with a joint venture with PetroChina in our Tianjin and Lanzhou locations. But now in the past 5 to 10 years, that's opened up, which is why we decided to invest in Zhuhai and build a facility there, so the plant as well as the laboratory. And there's opportunities. I think most of the cities are trying to build up their areas, their industrial centers. And so there's a lot of opportunities to work with them. In Zhuhai, they have a Gaolin Port economic zone where they're trying to build their industry, and they're willing to cooperate and find opportunities to work with outside investments. Also, I think Tier 3 cities have the opportunities, so it's not the big cities like Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangzhou, but Zhuhai, which is a Tier 3 city. And also the government's trying to do more inland. So instead of focusing on the coast, they're trying to build more of that industry and build their cities so that everybody's not migrating to the coastal areas, but build up the interior and the rural sections. I think we can go to some of the photos, because I'd like to show you what we've done in the past couple years. So this is our manufacturing site. We actually broke ground in 2010. It was about 400,000 square meters of space. And you can see that in March of 2012 to August of 2013, that's how long it took us to get the manufacturing facility constructed. We actually built on reconstructed land. It's land reclaimed from the sea. So it took us about a year to actually get that land in condition so that it was stable and we could begin construction. The part that I'm responsible for, which is the next slide, is actually building the lab. And so you can see where we broke ground in April, and then we actually finished in August of 2013. And it's 3 functions in the lab. We had a QA to support manufacturing, a tech service lab to support our business, and then also now I'm working on trying to build the R&D, which is kind of the longer term strategic projects to help build our business in China. And then this one's just to kind of put in perspective after having living in China for 2.5 years. It's a big study in contrast. This is right outside my apartment, so high rise, very nice apartment on the river, but you still have some guy living on a boat with his dog fishing from the river and doing his daily life on the river.
Good, thank you. I'm going to run that back real quick. Very good. And now I'd like to ask Kimberly Kirkendall about her experiences in China, especially in the realm of licensing and joint ventures. Kimberly Kirkendall, CPA, is the president of International Resource Development Cross-Cultural Catalyst. Her 25-plus years of experience in manufacturing, operations, and financial management have allowed her to live and work in the United States, Asia, and Europe. In Asia, she worked in Shanghai, overseeing factories, and later managed a U.S. subsidiary office in Hong Kong. She later started her consulting business to mentor and lead companies to expand, develop, and improve their international operations. She's often quoted in the media and has been an advisor to various organizations, including the World Trade Center, the Department of Defense Strategic Foreign Language Task Force, and many trade groups throughout the country. She has a bachelor's degree in international business from The Ohio State University, and where she also studied Chinese. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Akron and is a certified public accountant. Kim, can you tell us about the opportunities for businesses which have some experience in international business but are not ready yet to go into that full direct investment?
You know, as your graph illustrates, it's usually better to crawl before you walk. And a lot of companies have the attitude that their neighbors or somebody that lives, you know, another business in their industry already has a factory in China, so how hard can it be? It can be pretty hard, actually. So it's usually better to start out with many of my clients start out with hiring somebody in China to represent them as an agent to help them sell into the market first, or to represent them sourcing and buying product and finding raw materials that they can bring back. And once the U.S. company starts to adapt and understand, you know, how China works and how to manage those employees and the relationships that they have with their customers or their suppliers, then a couple of years later they think, okay, things are going well, let's take it to the next level. And they set up a trading company in China where they can buy and sell product, maybe mostly to sell into China or mostly to buy and bring back to the US. And then again, a couple years later, that's going well, hopefully, and they decide, okay, maybe it's time to have a factory there, either to support our customers in China or to bring the product back to the US. So that's the best way to enter a market, is because American companies, and I think more than many other countries, we are very optimistic by nature, and we're a can-do kind of attitude. So we think we can go over there, we can figure it out. And so it's better to get your feet dirty, have that initial experience, learn as you go, and then build from there.
Very good, thank you, thank you. We'd like to just move into some questions about the economy in China and continue with opportunities. And so my first question, and I'll throw it out to whoever would like to do it, what is your prognosis for the Chinese economy? We hear a lot of conflicting information. What are you seeing there when you're on the ground in China? And whoever would like to do it, go ahead, Kapi.
Yeah, I think from the specialty chemicals, in particular for Lubrizol's additive side of the business, you know, when we look at 2012 numbers, it's about, 15.5 million cars, right? What we project in 2020 is about 460 million cars. So the middle class economy is growing. A lot of people are starting to buy cars. We project probably an additional 6 million metric tons of new lubricant additive business. So it's in our best interest to be in China at that point to really build on that opportunity, because China's the growth area. They're building on terms of, you know, their transportation, and so we see that opportunity really improving and growing and quite quickly.
And just, you know, that brings up a point that I'd like you as you know, students and individuals interested in this to think about. Imagine it was your responsibility for, you know, the city of Mentor, that there were 150,000 cars, and in 5 years you were going to go from 150,000 cars to 400,000 cars, which is like going from, you know, or actually 15,000 to 400,000. Imagine being the person in charge of that. So, you know, as Americans, we often read in the newspaper about how China has such a poor environmental process and the government is trying to control things and People don't drive well, but think about taking a city from 15,000 to 400,000 in 5 years. How do you license that many drivers? How do you build enough gas stations? How do you have enough roads? Where do they park the cars? What happens, how do people learn how to handle a car accident if their parents never had a car and they were never in a car until they bought their first car and learned how to drive? So this is what China's been struggling with for the last 15 years, is such a rapid pace of growth in building and in the population and education and people going abroad and international trade and driving vehicles. And 20 years ago in China, you couldn't own your own apartment. You know, the government owned everything. So how do you phase into a population of 1.4 billion people the concept of ownership? And having a checking account and balancing it and getting paid. And so the level of change is beyond our imagination. It's like someone who was born in 1901 suddenly being in 2014 and having to adapt to cell phones and cars and toilets in the house. So it's important to have that perspective when you're looking at China as a market or an opportunity or a place to do business, because it's easy for us to criticize and it's hard for us to understand the history and environment that they've come into. And so if you're doing business with an executive, as Kapi will be working with an executive in China from the Chinese government negotiating something, that person 20 years ago couldn't have bought a car if he wanted to, couldn't have bought his own apartment, didn't have a checking account. So how does that influence how he negotiates and makes decisions today?
The prognosis for the economy is it's likely to continue to grow, but not at the rate that it had been. We predict around 8% a year, which is still great. And there's going to be a shift that will take place, and this will be toward more high-tech manufacturing, services, and financial institution. And some of the better sectors for opportunities are, they come in the energy, which makes sense, chemicals, transportation, medical equipment, construction, machinery, and anything related to the infrastructure and helping to have it grow and make it become what it needs to be. Branded products supporting lifestyle show great potential as well. And small companies will sell mostly through agents and distributor. But keep in mind, anybody setting up agents or distributors, you have to be able to support them and provide adequate sales and service. There's a number of ways to do this, and there's a lot of trade shows in China. The commercial service, which is part of the embassy overseas, helped organize 45 trade shows last year, and in 23 different industry sectors, is a way to help American companies become introduced to the Chinese market.
Thank you. Thank you. I wonder if any of you would share with us an example of success that a company that you've worked with, or the success of Lubrizol in doing any of these methods of getting into China. Just a specific kind of case study. Go ahead, Kim.
I'll start because I'm typically working with a smaller and medium-sized manufacturer, and because we don't always recommend that China be their first choice. But I successfully worked with a small company who was selling wines, Ohio wines specifically, and ice wines. Apparently our part of the country does a very good job of that. And this particular company was a distributor of all types of wines, but was very successful selling to the equivalent of Amazon China. And there were some things they had to do, but they were, they listened, they did their homework, I helped them, every step of the way. And what they had to end up doing was they consigned the product over there. So that means it had to stay there. But after, 4 months, if all of it wasn't sold, the company in China would buy it, and they agreed to purchase it. So they had, their agreement set up, and it worked very well. And as far as I know, they're still doing very well. And then I helped another company who makes specialty equipment, large piece of capital, machinery, and this was probably $1 million piece of equipment, and it took probably a year and a half to get this, all certified, because there are certain certifications you have to go through, and and standards you have to comply with to sell that type of equipment into China. But after that, you know, they were able to do it. After, you know, a year and a half, it was $1 million piece of equipment. It was very successful. But, you know, the thing here is this was, you know, specific niche type of products. Isn't for everybody, and you know, you have to have some capital so that you can afford to put the time into selling into China if you're a small business.
Great. Kapi?
Yeah, for Lubrizol, I mean, the additives market is pretty flat in North America and Europe. And so when we look at our numbers, the growth area and what we're seeing is growth in China, in particular Asia and China. I think by having the physical presence of a manufacturing site and a laboratory, we probably have customers coming every week to come and see what we build in Zhuhai. And it's kind of a physical demonstration to our customers saying that we are investing in China and for our customers so that we can bring them the supply as well as the technical expertise that Lubrizol is known for. We've brought in business with the international companies like Shell and BP. We're supplying them from our Zhuhai facility. And then we're also building with the national companies like Yunguan or Dongfang that are, you know, local national companies, but then they're also trying to grow. So it's really that physical demonstration. I think it's going to be bringing in more successes in the future.
I typically work with companies that are already in China when they're having a challenge. You know, they either want to grow or restructure their operations. So one of my clients had a sales office in southern China and a plant in northern China, and they sell hundreds of millions of dollars in equipment every year into China for processing tires, which is, again, with the automotive, is a huge industry, growing industry. But one of the, we took a look at the operations overall and the staffing situation, you know, where their focus in business should be, their growth. But one of the problems they were having was they typically make a lot of money on their equipment and aftermarket service. So when the machine has a problem in the US or in Europe, the factory will call their company and say, please have one of your technicians come repair the machine. And then they sell the aftermarket parts and they come and repair it. And what they found in China was that the Chinese customers would just let the equipment break. It would break, they would leave it sitting there, they didn't use it anymore, they didn't call anybody to fix it, and they had a team of 10 technicians who would go set up the equipment initially, train the company on how to operate the equipment, but they weren't being called back very often. Or if they were called back, they were told, you should do it for free, we don't want to pay you, you know, it should be under warranty. And I sat down with the company and said, one of your problems is that Chinese companies use the same methodology for a big problem that they use for a small problem. So all of the steps and the people that have to be involved to buy the $2 million piece of equipment are the same steps and people that have to be involved to buy the $50 part to fix it. And so if the guy on the factory floor doesn't want to tell his boss that this is a problem because all of a sudden it becomes his problem. So what we ended up doing was creating what I affectionately called a cult. And it's under the model of Apple computers. There are people in the market in the US and all over the world that pay money to become an Apple certified repair person. And they go through training and they get a certificate that says you're silver level or you're gold level and you can repair computers. So that's what we started to do with the employees in these factories that bought the equipment. When they went through the initial training, they were silver level trained. And we gave them a certificate and they got a t-shirt and it had a badge on the side and it said you're silver level trained. And this sounds really cheesy to us. But in China, where the work environment is more similar to here in the 1950s, that was important to them, that they had the certificate, that they had special training. So we told them, if you want to be gold level trained, you have to keep a logbook of all the repair work that you do on this, and you have to identify if there's a problem, and when there's a problem, you have to call one of our technicians. So we built into this silver, gold, platinum certificate training program, this group that they could belong to, a mechanism by which they were incentivized to call the company and say, I'm having a problem with the equipment, I need it to be repaired, and that they wanted to learn how to fix it themselves. And part of fixing it themselves was calling the parent company to say, how do I fix it and what supplies do I need? So it had a huge effect on their business, and the Chinese companies were excited, and as a matter of fact, the first 2 or 3 companies that they rolled this program out to were jealous. You know, who else got it before us? Did you train this other tire company before you trained us, and do they have any gold certified people, because we don't yet? So it really became to have a life of its own. So one of the things, you know, that lessons for companies in China is that you have to find a China perspective solution to the problem. You have to recognize what in their mind is stopping them from telling their boss that there's a problem with the equipment, and what can you do that will fit their value system to incentivize them to tell their boss there's a problem and to get the equipment fixed.
Interesting, very good. Earlier, Kim had mentioned that it was difficult to, maybe some issues with negotiating with people in China. And Kapi has a little package on the table here, and she was telling me earlier that that is very instrumental in the negotiations. So maybe you can talk about negotiations in China, and then we'll let everybody join in.
So I think the thing is that the dinner, the banquet, the meal is very important in terms of establishing the relationship even before you go into a lot of the negotiations. And as part of the banquet, well, then there's an alcohol that they have in China called baijiu. So literally translates to like white alcohol in a sense. And so what I brought over is 52% alcohol. So you get them in little glasses, and everybody does a lot of toasting during that process of building the relationship before you actually get into the discussion of what you're going to negotiate. So I brought an example here just so people can see that it's pretty strong stuff.
Yeah, that's good. It makes the conversation go easy after a while. I'm sure it doesn't help the understanding the language problems when everybody has had a little too much of that. Besides language, besides the need to develop relationships, what are some of the issues with negotiations in China, Kim?
You know, the Chinese like to say that Americans like to get married and then date, you know, and the Chinese would rather date first. So we tend to go into a negotiation and we say, okay, here's my list. Here's the 25 things we're going to talk about today, and we're ready to sign a contract and we want to go forward with this. And the Chinese typically want to understand who you are better first. And if you think about it, you know, 100 years ago, I always tell the executives, 100 years ago in the US, if my great-grandfather owned a dairy farm in southern Ohio, if a new customer came to his business, he didn't run a credit report on them. You know, he didn't put them on pay in advance terms. He probably invited them over to his farm for dinner. And then maybe he went to their farm for dinner. And he talked to the local leaders in their village or went to their church and met the pastor and said, what do you think about the Smith family? And that's how a lot of the rest of the world still does business. And we've really gotten away from that in the last 50 years. And so in international business in general, it's important to remember that when they say relationships, a lot of time American thinks that means bribery or favoritism, and it doesn't. It means I want to know who you are. Before I enter into a business arrangement with you, I want to know who you are. What's your character? What are your values? What kind of person are you? And so negotiation in China tends to go more slowly because of that. There's a lot of initial conversation and dialogue, and you're showing them your information, which builds trust. You know, you're sharing information with them, they're sharing information with you, and you're going through that. And then the second, I think, thing that's complicated about it is their value system is so very different from ours. So we tend to go in and negotiate and say, well, they want the lowest price, and the Chinese talk all the time about price. But a lot of times what's really important to them might not be price. It might be for the factory that Lubrizol, which I've had the opportunity to been at their factory a few times. Part of what's important to that community that they're building the factory in is how many people are you going to employ? Because China's unemployment rates, you know, for graduates from college is even higher than it is here, as hard as that is to imagine. So if the company can say, we're going to employ a lot of people and we're going to develop a lot of skill, that's a big deal. So you have to understand their perspective and value system when you go into a negotiation, because otherwise you may be assuming that the other party is trying to bring the price down, and they may be happy with you charging more money if you can give them more employees.
You know, I think they both hit on it, but you know, just a simple thing like the language. You know, language is a huge issue. Many Chinese businessmen are hesitant to negotiate in English, so it's probably a good idea for you to have somebody like Kim, or you know, a consultant or an advisor with you, especially if you're just starting out, to help hold your hand and make you understand some of the cultural issues that you're going to be facing.
Thank you. I'll throw this out to whoever would like to answer it. What's a key thing that Americans generally misunderstand about China, about the Chinese, about how we would do business with them? What's some of the greatest misunderstandings that we have?
I can start. I get more phone calls than you can imagine from companies that call me and say, I need the name of a lawyer in China because I'm going to sue somebody. And you know, their legal system is not set up like ours. I mean, if you read anything about the young student in Italy that was, you know, tried for murder, you know, the Italian legal system isn't set up like ours. So how can we expect the Chinese legal system to be set up like ours? But a lot of times when they call me with these problems, I ask them, well, what happened? You know, what did you do? What did they do? How long have you done business with them? What was the transaction? And 95% of the time, the real problem is the Americans think the Chinese are lying to us and that they've canceled the deal or they're holding money. And a lot of times the Americans have not heard what the Chinese have been saying before that. Very typically, the Chinese have said beforehand, we can't accept that order because your standards are too high. We can't make copper at that purity level. And the Americans don't hear it because Chinese is a very indirect language, and they carry that over into speaking English, into how they speak English. And so even if they're speaking English, they're doing it in a very indirect way. So what the Chinese executive might say is, that would be very complicated for us. And the American hears, oh, well, if you're going to make it, you can make it, figure it out. So then the factory tries to make it, and it fails, and the American says, you're cheating me. So these type of situations I hear of over and over and over again. You know, and I read articles in business magazines, Inc. magazine, Fast Company magazine. This American executive was, you know, taken advantage of in China, and I can read into it and see, no, the Chinese factory owner tried to tell him, I can't do that. You know, I don't want to ramp up that fast. I can't go from 10 million to 50 million. But the American thinks, oh, come on, you can do it. Here's the order, figure it out. And it doesn't work. And then we blame them because it doesn't work. So I think that's one of the biggest issues is communication. We're not hearing what they're saying. And then it leads us to a conflict point where we feel we've been honest and they haven't been.
I think from my experience, I think, you know, Lubrizol has a very strong sense of ethics, and so the Chinese way of doing business sometimes may not match with what Lubrizol expects, and especially with like the gift giving and the way you would do business with like local authorities. So that's been an adjustment, trying to make sure that our Lubrizol Chinese employees are aware of what Lubrizol's ethics are and making sure that they hold to that standard. Similar to what Kim's saying with the communication too. I think, you know, sometimes their English is very good, much better than my Mandarin, but sometimes you assume that they know what you're saying and then you realize that they don't. So sometimes you always have to double check with the English comprehension to make sure that we're both on the same page with what we're saying. And then I think the other thing that I've noticed too, part of that culture of, you know, can you move forward? I'm just asking you to do that. There's that sense of respecting the hierarchy or respecting the boss. And so sometimes they don't want to act unless they get the boss's approval. And I'm used to more the US way of just saying, you know what, let's just do it, take the initiative, you've got the power to do it. And there's always this checking back with the boss. I'm like, this is a simple decision, just move forward. I'm, you know, traveling or I'm not available, let's just move forward with that. And there's still that hesitancy to take that risk or be accountable for making that decision just in case it's wrong. And I think that's something else that we're trying to change with the culture that we have.
I think another issue for especially some of these smaller businesses who are hesitant is the whole, stealing my technology, the whole IP issue. And so they're very reluctant to say, oh, if I send my product over there, they're just going to copy it. And some of that is not necessarily that, they should take it that way. That is, in Chinese culture, that's considered to be, complimenting them. You are copying what they do, so you think what they do is great, so you're going to copy it as well. In the U.S., we don't really quite see it that way.
Good. Are there any rules or laws in China that are a surprise to American companies that they get there and go, oh, we never even saw that coming? Is there anything you run into?
Setting up a corporation in China is much different than doing it in the U.S. I have 2 clients right now in the middle of that with factories, both of them. And in the U.S., I could set up a company online in Nevada in 3 hours and be done with it. And I would still have to set up the employment agency, with the workers' compensation and that kind of stuff. But in China, it takes typically 6 months. And you have to write what is actually a de facto contract between you and the Chinese government that says, here's what we're going to do. Our company is going to come to this village or this city, and we are going to invest this much money, and we're going to employ this many people, and we're going to become profitable in 5 years, and we're going to grow the business. And that's a contract between you and the local government. And they take it seriously. And when you sign it and they sign it and your company is established and you get a business license, you have to invest the money you said you were going to invest over the next couple of years. And they're going to watch that you do. And 5 years later, if your business is doing something dishonest or illegal, or you're not employing people, the person that signed your original contract for the government feels guilty about that. That he believed you, that he accepted that you were going to build this business in China. So we see businesses as objects, and they still see businesses as an extension of the person that owns it, as you. So they have bankruptcy law in China, but it's very, very seldom ever used, because the idea that I could I have a company and that it could be bankrupt and I would leave my suppliers with no money is beyond me, because it's personal. How could I do that to my suppliers? It's not like it's just a company and the company owes their company money. When we have over 60, 70 years, we've evolved into that attitude that you can have a company and it's a separate entity and it can go bankrupt and leave people high and dry, and that's not personally your problem. It's the company's debt and problem. So there's still a much more personal connection to. And so the laws around how you set up a corporation or even how you do business further on are much more personally connected than they are here.
The thing I encountered was how to deal with what they call drug chemicals. Because normal things like chloroform, which we would put on the shelves in the lab here, now is considered a drug chemical in China, so we had to put it under lock and key. We also had to have a camera on it, which then went to the police station. And we also had to log in when we used it and report it to the police station. And then every time we wanted to restock, we'd have to go and submit a permit at the local authorities to make sure that we could get more inventory for that. So that was a whole new, completely different way of how we would handle what I would consider a normal chemical that we would use here in the US.
What would you use chloroform for?
Just for running some of our lab equipment or cleaning some of our glassware and stuff, and they considered that drug chemical, so they wanted us to report that.
Very good. And you had told me when we met at another time that there were rules about the equipment that you could bring into the lab.
Right. So as we were trying to build the lab and bring in instruments and equipment, they had a rule that you couldn't bring in old equipment. So nothing that, say we had a lab, equipment at the Lubrizol lab here, we couldn't ship that. It had to be new. And then if you're also buying new equipment or it's something that's international, between customs duties and taxing and all that, it would typically be about 25% more costly to bring it into China. So that was something we had to deal with in terms of that.
That really started about 10 years ago. because a lot of companies were selling used equipment to China. And as China started, from the mid-90s into the 2005 to really develop economically, they got a little chip on their shoulder about, you know what, we deserve new equipment. And so they just, and again, it's personal. There's a lot of things there that are personal. And the feeling is, why are you sending us your old equipment? If you're building a good factory here and you're going to make it successful and you really care about China, you should send us the best new equipment. Don't send us the old stuff. So it is a problem, and how the Chinese character that you use in your customs document, whether you call it repurposed or refurbished or repaired, makes a big difference whether it gets in the country or not and how it's taxed. So there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction that goes on in how the government sets rules and makes tax laws based on somebody else, causes a problem with chloroform, and all of a sudden everybody has to have chloroform covered with a video camera. Because again, they've gone through 100 years of development in 20 years, so they're always constantly reacting behind the curve a little bit, so they often overreact to things.
Yeah, and I think just for some of the smaller businesses, simply, you both hit on it. The import-export process is very complex, much more so than in some of the other countries they could start doing business with. And if you're not familiar, some of it has to do with even what port they import it into. How strict the customs agents are going to be. And, you could have your things tied up for a long time in customs, and it's incurring fees and duties. And so you have to really take time to understand.
Sometimes I think the political situation can influence how long something will stay in customs, because we've noticed that you could ship the same material with the same paperwork, 2 weeks before, and it maybe gets through in a couple days, and then the same material gets shipped, 2 weeks later or a month later, and it gets hung up. So there's no sense of a rhyme or reason as to what's going on, except sometimes we think the political winds can influence what someone wants to do or make a statement in terms of that.
Speaking of political, what's the biggest threat to Americans doing business in China, the current political situation? Is there anything that we need to know about, a business person would need to know about in the political?
The Chinese political situation has been relatively stable for quite a while. After Mao, the infamous Chairman Mao, the leaders that came after him tried to set up a group of between 7 and 9 people called the Politburo. And they are supposed to make sure that no one leader has that much control anymore. So everything has to go through them, basically, and they all have to agree on it. So Deng Xiaoping was a very famous leader to the West, but there still was this Politburo behind him that had to agree before he could move too much in one direction or another. So China has actually, from the Chinese perspective, been relatively stable since Tiananmen Square, when I was in China for Tiananmen Square at the time. But it's been relatively stable since then. I think what affects us as business people is when the US government and the Chinese government get into, tit for tat disagreements about you're selling too many tires, or you're influencing and we have protective measures for our certain industries in parts of our country as well. And so that sometimes has an effect where it can be difficult to get things through customs, or it can be difficult to get something approved. Something as simple as an application for your visa in your passport for you to travel to China. 3 years ago, it was a 2 or 3 page document, and it was pretty simple. Well, they got angry because we were supposed to make it easier for Chinese tourists to come here. There's a huge Chinese tourist market because there's a very big middle class with a lot of money and they want to travel. And we make it very hard for them to get visas to come here. So all of a sudden, the Chinese visa application blew up to like 8 pages. And you practically have to list your blood type. You have to list all the children in your family and everywhere you're going. It's gotten super complicated. So you do see that tit for tat situation where we don't, somebody in the national government in the US doesn't live up to some promise they made China, and all of a sudden they make it more difficult for us on something.
I think the thing I've seen with the new President Lee is he's trying to wipe out some of the corruption. And so we've noticed a difference with the amount of banqueting and gifts and things like that that's been going on. I mean, the last year we've cut out a lot of that, and it's been good because then you don't feel like you're obligated in trying to woo and build that relationship. It's a little bit more, you know, clean cut, and it's less corrupt in that sense. So that's been a good plus. I think it's much easier then to do business when you don't feel like you have to do all the wining and dining as part of that. Yeah.
And so when you talk about gifts in China, what kind of things did it used to be that would be a typical gift?
It would usually be centered around some of the festivals. So like in autumn, we have the autumn festival. So the big thing was giving gifts of moon cakes. And so we'd be giving gifts of moon cakes, but it had to be within a certain amount that met Lubrizol's, you know, policy as well. But it was just, you know, the expenditure and having to do that, and also probably a dinner that would go with that as well. Yeah.
Great. Kim, when you look at companies beginning to do business in China, you know, we've heard recently about the IPO for Alibaba, which is China's Amazon, kind of. And isn't that just the best thing that ever happened, and should everybody just use that? And I'm leading that question because I already know what her answer is.
Well, it's the largest B2B online marketplace in the world. However, it's a tool. So it's just one thing to consider when you're dealing with a seller or buyer. You still need to do all the necessary due diligence, and in some cases even more, because, you know, sometimes they can hide behind that facade and understand the terms of sale. You know, for example, many will want you to consign goods in the country, like I mentioned, you know, and sometimes you may not necessarily know that, and that's a typical thing that happens there. And, you know, if you don't have the cash flow to support, you know, having a bunch of inventory sit there that you're not getting paid for, then, you know, you probably shouldn't do that.
Yeah, if you, I'm just going to jump in. If you didn't hear that word, it was consignment. The product, you ship it to China and you don't get any money until it sells. So unlike other means where you would actually get some payment for it,
it's
regardless.
typical for small manufacturers to sell on what's called, you know, cash in advance. So, or you get, you know, they place the order and they pay you. They say, oh, okay, pay me half, and they'll pay half. And then you make the product and you're shipping it, and then when it's in transit, then they'll, you know, they'll wire transfer you the rest. And so that's typically how the smaller businesses will do business, because they really can't afford, and plus they just really don't have that comfort level or trust yet. And you know, to do something like this, it really kind of, you have to be ready to go to that next level, and it takes a little bit of a leap of faith.
Absolutely. I think you also said that if the product doesn't sell through Alibaba, you have to, it can be a challenge to get your product returned to the United States.
It can be, but you know, if you put your contract together the right way, in this situation with the person with the wine, they agreed that after 120 days, if it hadn't sold, you know, that they would actually, the company in China would buy it. And so, but they knew that ultimately they would get rid of it and sell it. They knew there was a market for it. Maybe it just wasn't going to be, you know. So it's important to negotiate this and understand this in your contracts.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Should an American business doing business in China have a withdrawal plan? Is it important to do that? And what kind of things would you consider in doing that?
You should always have a withdrawal plan. I mean, even if your business is in the US, even if it's a small business you run out of your house, you should always have a plan on, you know, how can I get out of this business, and how can I make sure I don't end up, you know, owing money I can't pay or having inventory I can't sell. So it's always important. And in China, it's especially important because it's 7,000 miles away and it's a different country's set of laws. And I always tell my clients, think carefully about opening a business in China because it costs more money and takes longer to close one down. And that has happened because in the early days, in the early 2000s, too many foreign companies came in, opened up businesses, hired employees, incurred debts, and then changed their mind and left employees unpaid and left debts unpaid. And the Chinese have no way to go to France and get you, you know, and make you come back and pay. So they've set up accounts so that when your company's first profitable, you have to put money into an account. Should you ever close down your business, that money's used to pay the workers. And there's a very long process to close your company. You have to prove that none of your employees have been left without being paid everything they were due, and that all of your suppliers have been paid, and that you have to wait a certain period of time to make sure there's no undisclosed liens or loans against your business. So they've made it, again, a knee-jerk reaction to that earlier situation was to go swing the pendulum the other direction. So yeah, you definitely need to think about how, and the biggest thing, even before you get to the closing part, is how are we going to make money out of this? It's great that you have a lot of customers in China. They're buying from your US factory, so you think, wow, we're going to have a factory in China to sell to our customers in China. How are you're going to make money at your Chinese factory? How do you bring that money back to the US? Do you do it through dividends? Do you buy product from the US and pay a markup on it? You really have to have, it's not easy to move money across borders. You have to have paperwork with that money. Why are you sending that money to the US? Is it for an invoice? Is it a profit dividend? Why are you sending that money? So, and there's a lot of very sophisticated companies that, in my experience, really don't think a lot of that stuff through well enough.
Okay, I just wanted to note, even with a small business that maybe just has a rep or a distributor, it's important, before you get started, to have an international attorney draw up a contract that basically gives you an out, and because every country has its rules about what you have to do to make a rep or a distributor whole. So if you decide they haven't been selling enough for me, they haven't done, you really have to have that down in writing that you agree, and both parties agree that after X time, if I haven't done this, this, and this, that we're going to end our relationship. And even then, there are usually laws and rules that are meant to cater to the local rep or distributor, and you still end up owing them X amount of dollars in unrealized commissions or whatever it might be.
And even without the laws and rules, even just from the money perspective, I have a client right now that called me. Their distributor owes them $250,000 for product that they shipped to the distributor that they think the distributor sold to customers, and then in the middle of all this, they said, we want to cancel our agreement. Well, their contract had not been renewed, so the date had expired, and the distributor's not paying them the $250,000 for the product, but who's to say, should they give the distributor some of that money towards we're taking your business away because you're no longer our distributor? So you have to have a contract, but you also have to manage your business so that they never owe you that much money, or that you have a means to get it back. You have to practically manage it and legally manage it. And we tend to go into these things thinking about the best possible circumstance, and we don't think about the worst possible circumstance.
Absolutely. Good, thank you. How can American businesses better understand the Chinese market? Where do you go to for information about, I'm ready to make this big step. Where do I go for help and to understand all of this?
I can start. There's a lot of resources out there. I printed this off and we could pass it around. The U.S. Export Assistance Center, which is part of the U.S. Commercial Service, which is in charge of all the embassy offices around the world. China happens to have, the U.S. has 5 of those in China. And that's a great place for small businesses, just starting out, and there's also other local resources such as myself and local trade assistance centers that basically have access to information. These embassy offices overseas have, they put out wealths of, a lot of good information about, the best industry sectors to consider. They help support local shows in the area. They will do something called a Gold Key service, which is basically they will help the small business find a potential partner, rep or distributor, and they'll help set up meetings for you, and they'll arrange for transportation and a driver, and they'll kind of help hold your hand when you get over there. And there's a lot of, chambers over there. AmChams are usually good resources. And, there's a lot of good I would say, so there's some law firms with offices in China that have popped up recently that are pretty good resources. And, you know, there's a lot of good, I would say, consultants out there now that are specializing in China that can help with all of that. But it's important not to go it alone. You definitely do need to rely on some of those resources.
I was going to say Lubrizol uses a lot of resources. So a lot of times having an agent or someone over there that knows the business, that's how we got started. Also sending people over, expat assignments, and then also using Kim's services to say, let's get our employees that are maybe working here in the US, but how do they interact with the people in China, getting that cultural training so that they're a little bit more savvy. So there's a lot of resources that we tap in order to kind of make sure that we're building that business in the right way.
Let me have kind of one final question, and then we'll open it up to everyone to talk about. And we'll start with Kapi. What's it like to live there?
Well, I think my picture kind of just says it's a big, contrast in what you would expect. I think in terms of daily life, the things that are different from here that I notice is, you can't drink the water on the tap. So you have to either boil your water or drink bottled water. I'm not allowed to drive. So I have a driver, which is another adjustment in how, my independence and getting around. So I think some of those things like that just kind of make you realize that living over there is very different, and it's very different when you're even living in a hotel, because I lived in a hotel for the first month, and you still felt like you had that safety net that, you could find someone that spoke English. But once I moved in my apartment, then it was like reality hit. And fortunately, I speak some Cantonese, so I could get by with it. But my second night in my apartment, guess what? I locked myself out of my apartment. So that was a lesson in saying, all right, I got to find someone, I got to get back in my apartment, and obviously I did. But it is very different, yeah.
You've lived there.
Yeah, I moved to China in 1986, so probably a good portion of you weren't born yet. And it's much different, as you can imagine, now than it was then. But I think what's most difficult for most Americans, the food's very difficult. The Chinese have a saying that they eat anything with its belly to the ground, basically anything that doesn't walk upright. So every kind of seafood and animal that you can imagine, and China, as Kim said, has been a net importer of food for a long time. So there's a reason that they eat everything they can get, because the starvation has been a big part in China's history for hundreds and thousands of years, until very recently, actually. And so the food it's much more varied than what we eat, but the texture is softer. So I flew in from Orlando, and I was with a Chinese company down there for a few days, and the guy said to me, he said, I'm so sick of American food because everything is just so, you have to just chew it. Think about hamburgers, biting into hamburgers, or cutting steaks, or, and Chinese food just tends to be a lot softer, and there's less texture to it. So that's hard for us after a while. It's also a country of 1.4 billion people, most of whom live in the East Coast, in very dense circumstances. So if you were next to somebody in China, I could be like this with Chris, and I wouldn't even think about the fact that I'm doing this. But to Chris, I'm in her personal space. You have a foot on either side of you that's your personal space. And in China, they can be packed right next to each other, and somebody can be on their phone screaming at a friend or a family member, and if you tap them on the shoulder, they look at you like who are you? I mean, they're in a bubble, a mental bubble, so they don't even realize that you're standing there listening to them scream at their boyfriend or girlfriend or whoever. So it's a very different sense of personal space also. And that's hard and it's hard, you think about it the opposite way, it's hard for the Chinese that come here because they feel very lonely when they're here. They're not as close to people, they have a roommate or they have friends, and yet we still sit apart from each other. So they feel like they've done something wrong, and that we don't really like them as much. So it goes both ways. It's hard, there's things that are hard for us when we're there, and there's things that are hard for them when they're here. I can be in China. I was traveling with the CEO of one of my clients, And I had worked with his staff in the factory for a couple days, and at the end of my visit, I was getting ready to leave, and the 2 or 3 of the young women were next to me, and one had her hand on my knee and her arm on my shoulder, and the other girl was holding my hand and playing with my hair. So they're both practically in my lap, you know? And this American CEO walks in and he looks at me and he's like, oh, making friends, are we? But in China, that was a very natural thing for them to do. And it just meant that they were thankful that I was there because they saw me as someone who was helping them with their jobs. You know, so the food, I think, is the biggest difference. The personal space is another really big difference.
I think the thing that Kim's pointing out is, you know, once they know you, I mean, it's almost like your family. Because the guys in the lab, you know, oh, you can't carry your briefcase. Let me carry that for you. You know, it's kind of like they treat you like you're helpless. But then when I'm traveling, I will have Chinese strange men will cut in front of me, or when I'm standing in line at the grocery store, someone will cut in front of me because they want to get their, you know, produce weighed before me. So it's
because they don't know you.
Right, because they don't know you. So that's, I think, the other thing that takes an adjustment, whereas I think in the US society, we have kind of more politeness that extends to strangers as well as family. But in China, it's kind of the extremes, you know. Once you know them, it's like your family, and then the other extreme is, you know, I'm going to cut in front of you if I can.
Thank you. Let's open it to some questions from the audience. Anyone who has something they want to say? Yes, ma'am.
From what I understand, no. You know, again, the Chinese, typical Chinese market environment 20 years ago was an outdoor market with, you know, animal carcasses hanging from a rope and fresh vegetables and no real refrigeration until the mid-90s. So they're more where we were in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So right now, there's more concern about food safety. How was it transported? You know, if it's packaged, how was that meat killed, and has it been refrigerated, and is it safe? You know, and this is why you go into a Chinese restaurant and your dinner is swimming in a fish tank right in front of you and you get to pick it out, you know, where there's the whole, you don't want to, you want a list of foods I've eaten? Alligator tail and bamboo worm and bee larva. I don't recommend crocodile tongue because if a crocodile can't chew its own tongue, you can't chew its tongue. And typically these things are laid out for you so that you can see that they were healthy when they were killed. So there's a huge mistrust of even natural food. So they're starting to get a little bit into organic and non-chemical. A lot of my friends that are having babies want me, my suitcase is half filled with organic baby products, you know, lotions and vitamins and things that I take over for friends that have kids. So that's a concern. But I think GMO is just not even on their radar.
That's too far advanced, because I think when I arrived there, you know, Chinese nationals told me, you know, soak your vegetables because you don't know what pesticides and fertilizers have been there. And even if food is processed, it said try to avoid processed food because you don't know how they've handled it. So you really do have to be careful with what you eat and drink over there.
Good question. China is actually a lot more like Europe than the United States. Each province, which is what they call their states, each province has a lot of leeway in how they implement. The national government issues the regulations, typically, whether they be tax or incorporation or you know, social regulations. But each province has a lot of leeway in how they implement them, all the way down to the cities and villages. So for example, the clients I'm working with right now to put factories in China, if we go to a city like Canton, and then we look at a city like Youngstown, Canton's social benefits, their pension, their Medicare, their insurance benefits, might total 30%. Youngstown's could be 60%. So you can find dramatic differences between one city and another, or one region and another. And that's something a lot of Americans don't anticipate. They think China's one country, it's going to be the same wherever I go. And the languages are different. in different parts of the country too. So it's actually very regionalized.
Doing business in China, I would say probably of all the manufacturers there, maybe you've got 10% doing business in China. Now you've got a number of them importing from China, but exporting to China. And a lot of that tends to be some of your bigger companies. Now there are a few scattered ones with facilities over there. And that's just because of, the lack of knowledge and the lack of, ability to understand. So that's part of what I'm trying to do, is to help educate them. And quite honestly, in some cases, their product may not fit the Chinese market. Not everybody should export to China. It just depends.
No, I think, ethics is an outcome of your value system. And our value systems are very different because our economic and social environments over the last few hundred years have been very different. And so, we both cultures value honesty, and both cultures value respect. And if you put a list of what we would consider good ethical traits, they would value those as well. It's how you demonstrate that's different. And so it's not, and as far as employees are concerned, in China, the parents of the young workers now, so if you have some 25 and 30-year-old workers, their parents worked in an environment where they didn't have any rights. The government assigned where you worked. The government assigned who went to college or not, what you studied in college, where you worked. And the company that you worked for was always the government owned all the companies. And the company assigned where you lived. So it was a completely planned and controlled economy. And you've gone from that in basically one generation to people working independently. So the whole idea of what is the company's rights and responsibilities and what are the employees' rights and responsibilities has been very fluid over time. The pendulum swung about 5 or 6 years ago in favor of employee rights, and actually the benefit percentages, Americans are shocked at how high Social Security and pension and insurance are in China. It's much higher than it is here for employees. Employees have overtime rules. There's better vacation rules, fabulous maternity. We as a country we're, I think, the only developed country in the world that does not have paid maternity. There are some other undeveloped countries that don't, but we're the only developed country that doesn't. And theirs can last for 3 months. So, and it's paid not by the company, but by an insurance pool of money that companies have been paying into over time. So in some ways, they have more government support for employees than we do. And ours is, they're on contracts. You have to have a contract with every employee for 1 or 2 or 3 years, and here it's employment at will. On other methods, because unemployment is high and because a lot of people are unsophisticated, the laborers that come to work in the factories, they can be taken advantage of, and they don't know what their rights are, and they don't feel comfortable going to the local police or government to exercise those rights. So you kind of have a better system in place, but it's not followed a lot of the time. Does that answer that question? I love that question. And actually for me, and again, I'm 30 years into this, so I have a very long perspective on it, but for me, I love it. I love it. Because, and for 2 things that we like to criticize, communism and the one-child policy. Part of how Mao got to power was appealing to the disenfranchised in China, because the nationalist Taiwanese party was made up more of the educated people who were landowners and had been in government. So Mao said, I need to reach out to the uneducated and to women who didn't have any authority at the time. And so women were in the communist military from the very beginning. you know, and they held positions of power in the government from the very beginning. So if you looked at a photograph in the, you know, China Daily of 20 of China's top aeronautic engineers, probably out of 20, you'd have 4 or 5 women. So it's not 50-50, but in this country, out of 20, you might have 1 or none. And then with the one-child policy, you know, that one child now, that's been going on for 40 years in most of the country. And that one child is your, I affectionately say, your 401k plan. You know, so you want that child to do well, they're your investment. And if half the population that has one child has a girl, then you want that girl to do well. So especially for the middle and upper class, they've been pushing their daughters into college and into business and into making money. And it's made it harder for the young men because the young women's parents are saying, why bother getting married unless he brings something to the table? So the young men are kind of marrying the lower income girls who don't have other options or whose parents haven't pushed them to do that. Now, having said that, in the last 5 years, I think it's changing because the parents that have only a boy, the culture in China is still patriarchal. The family goes through the boy's bloodline. So the parents tend to buy the boy an apartment, you know, and financially set him up. And I do have young Chinese women friends that parents have bought them apartments too, but it's much more common with the male. So if the male gets married, then it's typically his parents that finance his apartment. So this transfer of wealth through the young men instead of through the young women, I think is leading to more of a disparity in men's ability to grow economic wealth through capital versus the young women's ability to do the same. But it's actually, I was treated, especially 25 years ago, as a foreigner more than I was treated as a woman. And now I think you may get some issue in some very rural areas, but not as much as you would expect. Certainly not as much as here. I have more of a problem here.
Yeah, I think for me, I haven't noticed any too much of a difficulty. I think the title helps. I mean, that goes a long way. I also think some of the Western style that I have that I'm just going to speak up also kind of helps overcome some of that. So I haven't found too much of a difference, but like Kim's saying, I do have a lot of young single women that are focused on their careers working with me in Zhuhai. So they're focused on building their career instead of getting married. It hasn't been. I think if anything, it's showing our international partners that we're also committed to helping them grow in Asia. What we have seen is that some of the international companies that have offices in Europe, we used to have to do more of the business and discussions in Europe because they were making the decisions. But now that's turning where they're trying to push decisions to be done in China. So that's a good sign for us as well, that we're seeing that the focus is to let the local people make the decisions. So it's been actually a plus for us to say that we don't have to work through the European office, which could be sometimes remote or not, fully understanding what's going on in Asia. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming out tonight, and please help me to thank our guest speakers because this was just wonderful.